Good morning, Watershed. My name is Shawn. It is really great to be here with you today. And thanks for those of you who have sent messages of love and strength this week. I got back yesterday from Costa Rica. I'll fill you in a little bit on why, but it has a lot to do with what I wanted to talk about today, even though I've been prepping this talk for a few weeks now. I'm dubbing 2021 the year of the Matriarch. Both of my grandmothers left Earth this year. At 98 and 99 years of age, they were both born in the immediate wake of the last pandemic. And I can't help but think that grit, that tenacity, that perseverance were probably part of their birthright. My grandfathers, by contrast, have been gone from this earth for a long time, both dying very early, and both leaving their respective wives to become head of household, to head their families alone. These two women raised 12 children among them and buried 5. I don't know that kind of strength, but to grow up with these matriarchs on both sides of my family has taught me a lot about the strength of women, about what it means to be an anchor. In February, I lost one grandmother. In April, the other. Then in July, just a few weeks ago, my own mom was diagnosed with cancer. Doctors found a tumor in her colon, so they operated on her, got that out along with half of her colon, and it has spread to both liver and lungs. So I just got back from Costa Rica to be with her, to try to give her some moral support. She starts chemo tomorrow. It's an aggressive, rare form of cancer. So sorry for that, but you can see why I have women on the brain and in my heart. But also the feminist in me, the brown in me, the immigrant in me is always invested in stories of the other. So when planning for this series came up, I naturally gravitated to stories of women. And in the Bible, while there are many, many, many great women, only 2 hold the distinction of having books named after them. I know I've said this before. I teach creative writing at a university here in Charlotte. I'm attuned to stories. I'm a storyteller myself. In the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, we encounter lots of short stories, but there are only 3 that get pulled into isolated books. A couple weeks back, Blair explored the tale of Jonah. The short story genre certainly shows up throughout Israel's history over and over again. If we look at these stories from the lens of literary analysis, we find really elevated stories told with fanfare and ceremony, complete with action-packed plots, romance, suspense, robust characters. If you're one that gravitates to the parables of the New Testament, then I think the short stories of the Torah or the Old Testament would hold your imagination equally. When we look at these stories closely, we see the stuff of legends. We see heroes. So today I want to delve into the stories of the Hebrew Bible, of Ruth particularly, and Esther. And as I said before, these women are remarkable, so much so that they're the only 2 books of the Bible named for women. In a year that is showing up for me with lots of suffering, in a year so profoundly centered on the women in my own life, I have been spending time with the women of the Bible. And these 2 are worth spending time with. And I realize it's a little bit of an ambitious and tall order to try to cover both of them on a Sunday morning, but my hope is maybe to whet your appetite enough to inspire you to spend some time with these ladies on your own. The books of Esther and Ruth illustrate God's redemptive promises, but they also showcase the strength, the tenacity, and intelligence of women. Esther is an orphan, Ruth a widowed foreigner. What sense of agency do these women have, especially in a world made by and for men, especially when they operate from deep within the margins of their otherness? And yet, Esther becomes queen and saves her Jewish people from certain annihilation. And Ruth becomes the ancestral grandmother to Jesus himself. These are women who do not passively wait for people to solve their problems, but rather orchestrate solutions that activate the men around them. At first glance, a reader might fail to see their greatness, especially given such humble beginnings. I'd like to start chronologically, which means we're going to start with Ruth. And growing up, I'll be honest, I grew up Catholic. She's the one I was more familiar with, and she represented the ultimate love story. I don't know if any of you guys ever grew up with the phrase, "I'm waiting on a Boaz, not a bozo." That maybe, I don't know, that's a Catholic thing. Don't tell. Anyway, that was like a little fun little joke that, whatever. Anyway, so the story of Ruth was framed by her obedience, at least when I was growing up. It was framed by her obedience. Her faithfulness is what got her a good husband. Hers were attributes to aspire to. But in those old tellings of the story, she wasn't exactly the central character, but rather an accessory to the major players, Naomi and Boaz. Obedient, faithful, loyal Ruth was rewarded for her good deeds, but I saw her only as the recipient of God's grace and providence. I failed to see how much she provided to secure her own future. When I read the story now, I see two women in beautiful relationship, actively fighting for a future worth having. Ruth and Naomi are both recently widowed at the beginning of the story. As single women, they have no economic, no social capital, no security whatsoever. Their livelihood is on tender hooks. This relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law is the centerpiece. The families we make outside of bloodlines, the sisterhoods we forge from like experiences. Okay, so I need you guys to hang with me for a second. There's been a lot of Disney Plus. The two twins that were up here, they're mine, they're 8. And in pandemic times, we have Friday movie night. We've exhausted like all the options, so we're recycling. And we're going back to some older movies. So I realize I'm drinking the Disney Kool-Aid, and maybe this won't track with you guys, but we're gonna try. I wonder if maybe Ruth and Naomi could be the original Anna and Elsa. I don't know, let's give it a think. No, but really, I wonder what an epic sisterhood like Ruth and Naomi's offer a world. I have a friend who quizzed her daughters after Frozen came out a few years ago. She asked them, they were, I think, 10 and 8 at the time, who the hero of the story was. Without hesitation, one of her girls said, Kristoff. And I wonder if we, and by we I mean society, culture at large, if we are training our girls to see heroes as male only. I see that challenged a lot today, and I'm thankful for that. But beyond being outrageously problematic from a gender equality standard, it's scary to me that we are not teaching girls that they can be the heroes of their own stories. It's scary to me that we criticize women like Simone Biles for taking charge of their own bodies, their own health, their own destinies. In the intertwined story of Naomi and Ruth, we have the antidote to toxic masculinity, to masculinity that parades around as heroism. Naomi, who has lost everything, is destitute. She's swallowed by grief and has nothing to offer her daughter-in-laws. She tells them to head back to their parents' home, in essence allowing them to cut ties. Orpah does so, and who could blame her? She's a Moabite, as is Ruth. Moab isn't just an outsider country, it's almost like a known enemy state of Israel. And the two places are very hostile to each other. Jewish people did not exactly esteem folks like Ruth. That Ruth chooses to follow Naomi as a Gentile is very symbolic. We find Ruth at a crossroads in her life, and it is this moment that defines her. In words that become immortal, Ruth tells her mother-in-law, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Listen, it's not like Ruth has more agency or more ability to pull her mother-in-law out of economic dire straits. This verse then becomes a stunning expression of faith and loyalty. And these two women forge ahead together, their destinies woven like Anna and Elsa, just a little bit. I think. What we see in the beginning of this story is an incredible set of circumstances that are hard for two widows to overcome. There's famine. Naomi's sons have died right before they could sire children, so there's isolation in the story too. Naomi is too old to start over. Her words, not mine, that's from the script. And Ruth has no progeny of her own. So barrenness, reinforced by the contextual famine, is also a theme here. This is a very bleak picture for the two of them. So Naomi and Ruth set off to Bethlehem, and as the story goes, Ruth begins to glean the grain fields of a farmer's nearby. Unbeknownst to her, it's Boaz's field. Boaz is a relative of Naomi's dead husband. Okay, so a couple interludes. Interlude number 1. Gleaning was a practice of leaving behind usable grain in the field for those in need after harvesting. It's described in Leviticus. Basically, it entails provision for the poor. So Ruth tells her mother-in-law that she's headed out to glean the field, and Naomi tells her, go ahead and go. The scripture here doesn't mention the women being worried, because this is an established practice, and Ruth knows she can provide for herself and her mother-in-law in this way. She doesn't wait for someone to show up and provide for her, but rather she acts. Interlude number 2, Boaz is her relative. This makes him a guardian redeemer. Again, Leviticus tells us that guardian redeemers have this obligation to redeem a relative in serious difficulty. Right? Ruth has also made a good reputation for herself because she's done this good deed by sticking with Naomi. So she's found favor in Boaz's eyes. This, coupled with his obligation to redeem, and it's not a you should do this, it's almost like a legal obligation in those times. This coupling of obligation and his sort of respect for Naomi are going to provide for Ruth, and by extension, Naomi, security. In chapter 2, Boaz pays Ruth a compliment for her steadfast loyalty and wishes blessings upon her. He says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Not but a chapter later, we see this very concept of wing refuge echoed, but this time by Ruth herself. She's on the threshing room floor. That's where they process the grain before there were big old machines. And Boaz is there. All of his workers are there. Ruth, they've all put in this really long, hard day. There's been a good meal. There's been good wine. And now it's time to turn in. And following Naomi's very specific instructions, Ruth boldly approaches Boaz at night and sleeps next to his feet. It's weird, whatever. Boaz wakes up. He's startled, asks who it is. And Ruth replies, I am your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. And I'm not sure, but I feel like there's some innuendo in there. But certainly, from a literary standpoint, we can appreciate the symmetry between God's wings and the skirts of Boaz's garments, providing refuge. Certainly, maybe we can see the divine irony. I don't know anything about foot fetishes, but y'all, Boaz replies with this. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after a younger man, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. That escalated quickly for me, but where it's gonna go is a short story. Anyway, there's apparently another guy who's more closely related to Naomi, and therefore by love right obligation, that younger guy should offer to marry Ruth. Boaz promises to look into it, but he seems in the text to desire Ruth for himself. The scriptures do not talk about beauty. They talk about honor. It's Ruth's good deeds. Her actions are what ultimately save her. She has created the circumstances that ensure her good future. The story ends, like all happy ones do, with good fortune. Boaz and Ruth marry. I've left out a couple details, but they marry. God blesses the union with a son. Naomi, that mother-in-law, cares for that child as if it were her own grandson. We are told that Ruth, who loves Naomi and is better to her than 7 sons, has renewed what was taken from Naomi. This is an idyllic tale, one with really no bad guys in it, one that holds up what ideal society should look like. how we ought to treat the other in our midst, how we ought to live. The book poignantly ends with the bloodline. We know the child's name is Obed. Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of great King David. Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, she becomes the ancestral grandmother of Jesus. So hopefully we've got this slide coming up. We move in the structure of the book of Ruth from emptiness to fullness. The course of Ruth's life does a complete about turn. And yes, the story is most definitely about God's provision. And yes, most definitely Boaz is a critical player in that provision. But these women ultimately saved themselves. That a book of scripture is dedicated to a woman who is not of Jewish birth, that she espouses ideal characteristics Jewish people aspire to, and that she is richly rewarded is so chiefly significant to me. Yes, 100%, this is a story of how to treat the stranger in our lands. We had Karen Gonzalez during that pandemic series when we were just virtual come and talk to us about it. She told us about the beauty of this story as an immigrant story. Certainly, with the events unfolding in Afghanistan, we can glean from this story a lot. But at its core, I also see a story of self-agency, of making a way for yourself despite the odds being stacked against you, about the strength of women and sisterhood. Ruth is depicted as noble, but she's also confident. She knows what kind of person she is, and that moral confidence allows her to make bold moves. The values of love, loyalty, faith, charity, and hospitality are fruits of righteousness. She steadfastly believes in God's word. She doesn't doubt herself. She knows she is good, beloved. How would that steadfast belief that you are good, beloved by God, alter your own actions, alter your own ways of securing your future? It's a good question. In the same way that the book of Ruth provides symmetry and a reversal of outcomes, Esther's too is a book of opposites, as biblical scholar Robert Alter points out. It reads like a juicy soap opera. I'm going to be honest, it's definitely less Disney, and it's really peculiar because in the entire book, God's name is never mentioned, not once. So Ruth's story unfolds in pre-exile days. Esther's telling happens after the Jews have been forced to flee and scatter. Where Ruth is a stranger in Jewish land, Esther is a Jewish orphan, a stranger living in Persia. So we have some symmetry there. The book of Esther is actually the origin story for the Jewish holiday Purim. So here are the players. We have our title character, Esther, who by a wild chance replaces a headstrong Persian Vashti as queen. Then we have the emperor king. His name is Ahasuerus. Can't say it correctly. My apologies to history. But we're just going to call him king or emperor for the rest of this story. He does not know that Esther is a Jew when he picks her out of obscurity to be his wife and queen. And then there's Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who steps in to act as guardian for the girl. And then we have Haman. He's the vice regent, think like royal council or vizier to the emperor. Haman is the ultimate bad dude, and he's promising a genocidal killing of the Jews. So here, this one's a little bit longer, so I've condensed this to the Cliff Notes version. The story opens with a lavish banquet, and there's feasting, and it's lasted several days. And on day 7 of really good libations, King Emperor A requests Queen Vashti's presence because he wants to show off her beauty. She refuses. The king consults his advisory circle, and they agree it's time to replace her because she's too headstrong. At the onset, we see a king very easily persuaded by those who surround him. At every turn in this story, he appears to be a passive king. His dialogue in the story is really short in contrast to the speeches of his council. He's ambivalent, perhaps, for sure passive, and most certainly malleable. Anyway, the plan is to replace Vashti with a better woman. So a bunch of virgins are rounded up, and they're trained in like what I again, this is just my take, a very primeval version of like The Bachelor. I'm not joking, it's like 7 months, and they get anointed with perfumes and oils and trains, and just read it for yourselves. Because I think the emperor beds each of the 7 final contestants, and after the king loved Esther more than all the women, which I think is code word for something else. Anyway, Esther becomes queen. I don't know, you gotta read it. Mordecai, Esther's adoptive dad, tells her not to reveal her heritage. In the whole of almost a year that she's been cooped up in this bachelor pad contest, Mordecai has been visiting her. It seems that he has this premonition that his people could profit from gaining favor with the king. So some time passes as Esther is queen, and Mordecai refuses to kneel before Haman. Now remember, he's our antagonist. And it straight up angers Haman. Now, the king has decreed that people should show this type of deference, this bowing to his vizier. But day in and day out, Mordecai refuses to bow. So Haman, in his rage, sets up a plot to not only kill Mordecai, but all of the Jews. Now, a Jewish queen sits on the throne, but no one knows this. Haman approaches the emperor, concerned for a scattered people with different rules who don't observe the king's command. And shouldn't we do something about that? So passive and easily persuasive, king gives Haman full royal authority. And essentially, a huge cash prize is offered to anyone who will kill a Jew. So this sets up scene for a genocide. Mordecai catches wind of the plan. He dons on sackcloth and ashes and basically stages a protest in the city. Jews catch word of the plan, and they all enter into mourning. Word gets to Queen Esther, and she is badly shaken by the news. These are, after all, her people. An important exchange between Esther and Mordecai occurs. Mordecai tells Esther that she must entreat the king. She tells him she can't simply just show up before him in court. She has to be summoned, and she hasn't been called to the bedroom in a month now, so she's a little worried that she's starting to lose favor in his eyes. If she seeks him out without being called into his presence, she could be sentenced to death. Again, we're reminded that women do not share the same sense of agency or power as their male counterparts, even when she is a queen. So Mordecai responds with basically 2 appeals. The first is, don't think you can escape the same fate from inside the palace walls. And then this one, for if you keep silent at a time like this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther asks Mordecai and her people to fast and pray, and she acts. With her cunning mind and using her beauty to her advantage, she boldly seeks the king in the inner court and asks for the king and Haman to come to a feast in their honor. There's a lot more that happens, but the gist is Esther sets Haman up. She reveals that she, along with her people, are to be annihilated and killed. And when the king demands to know who has dared level such a threat against his queen, Esther reveals then at that moment her Jewish identity. So of course Haman doesn't succeed in his nefarious plot. No, in the very gallows he had built for Mordecai, he is hanged. Mordecai himself is elevated to the emperor's inner circle, given Haman's position, in fact. It's all rather spectacular, but the Jewish people are saved thanks to Queen Esther. I wonder if a child were quizzed like a PG version of the story, who they would say the hero is of this tale. The king is simply a pawn. I think we can agree to that. Mordecai, virtuous and noble Mordecai, is still an accessory. No, the hero here is the orphan exile Esther, whose smart calculations and bold ask save her people. Now, I said this book, astonishingly, does not mention God's name once. Maybe there needed to be some disassociation from the... Anyway, not once. But it's clear to me, it is so clear to me how the divine uses a woman to save the Jewish people. Mordecai implores Esther, maybe even gives her a directive, but he offers no real advice, no strategy on how to approach an emperor or how to succeed in so dangerous a mission. No, Esther solves this problem on her own. She formulates a plan, activates it, patiently sets the trap, and sees it through, knowing her life and so much more is on the line. Like Ruth, she's not a passive character. She doesn't sit by and wait for her future to play out, her fate in the hands of someone else. So why short stories? Scholar Norman Gottwald suggests that the new purpose of the Israelite short story points to the active participation of people in common life. Put another way, the realm of the ordinary life with its ordinary people is the exact place where Yahweh works. These are lay stories. Sure, one takes place in a palace, but absent from both of them is formality or religious practice. Esther, setting a table for the feast. Ruth, gleaning a field. These become sacred spaces where God is doing some of their best work, which is to say, can't the changing table in a nursery, the waiting room of a hospital, the labor in a backyard garden, the work done through a computer screen or in a classroom, can't these be holy spaces too? The stories of these women make me wonder if we are perhaps not created for our own moment of greatness. If there isn't a simple time such as this playing out in our own narratives. I am still reeling from my mother's diagnosis, still sitting in profound grief over the loss of my grandmothers. The back half of this year feels so uncertain. I head back to teaching in the classroom really soon. Now I wrote likely still with my mask on, definitely still with my mask on, and I am bargaining. I am pleading, I'm begging God to keep my mother's spirit tethered to her body, because I cannot begin to think of the alternative. I am unsteady. That's like a really underwhelming word. I'm very unsteady. But I look to Ruth, I look to Esther, whose stories started with such uncertainty, devoid of hope. I see how God provided, how these women changed their futures despite great suffering. I see models for how to harness our own potentials. This series has been about re-examining scriptures, about scratching a little deeper. For some of us, it's about hearing some of these stories for the first time. I don't know where you sit in that continuum, but I hope that this series inspires you to crack open that sacred book or the app, No Judgment, and make your own discoveries. Watershed, I'm going to close this out in prayer. I don't know if you're going to be able to make out the words because I'm fairly certain I'm going to start crying, but I want to enter into sacred space. I want my every action to be a ministry of presence. It feels too much, right? Like earthquakes in Haiti and deep suffering and travesty and death and loss in Afghanistan and work that's not going to be quite normal and pandemic that doesn't seem to end and such a politicized, divided mess among coworkers and friends, and Facebook is like toxic. It's too much. But if I reduce it down to the minute, to giving thanks for my morning coffee, to traveling mercies that allowed me to be here today with you, to the crinkly eyes I can see despite masks on, which tell me people are smiling. These are the things that matter. these are the things that become anchors in an unsteady world. Watershed, you're an anchor for me, and I thank you. In this pandemic, you are an anchor for me, and I thank you.